For over 100 years, millions of Americans have sat down to breakfast with a familiar face smiling back at them from a pancake box. The face of a woman. That woman was supposedly a happy plantation cook named Aunt Jemima, who had a secret family recipe that made the fluffiest, most delicious pancakes in the Old South. But here's the thing. That woman was real. Her name was Nancy Green, and the story told about her couldn't have been further from the truth. Nancy Green became America's first living trademark, one of the first Black corporate spokeswomen, and arguably the country's first celebrity chef. She was famous from coast to coast, appearing at major exhibitions and fairs, and her face was recognized by more Americans than most politicians of her day. The way that 1980s kids knew the face of Ronald McDonald was the way that all of America knew the face of Aunt Jemima. And yet, she died with practically nothing. After nearly 3 decades of fame, she would meet her end in a way that perfectly captured the tragedy of her entire life. Randomly, senselessly, and far from the wealth and security her celebrity should have provided. But her story is about so much more than pancakes. It's about a woman who survived slavery, found freedom and fame, and yet could never escape the poverty that shadowed her from birth to death. It's about how America built fortunes on the backs of people who received almost nothing in return. And this isn't just an issue of race. You might not know the name Lorraine Collette, but you likely have seen the young girl on the Sun-Maid Raisins box. Yes, Lorraine was also a corporate mascot whose image was used in a similar way. She was the Sun-Maid Fair Maiden who also rose to fame and never to fortune. But today, we'll talk about pancakes. This is the story of Nancy Green, the smiling mammy who made a corporation rich while remaining poor herself. Let's get into it. But first, if you want to hear the most scandalous stories from yesteryear, please subscribe. I have 194,000 subscribers, and I'm grateful for each and every one of you. But I'd really love to have 194,001 subscribers. And I can't do that without you. Yes, you. Now, let me tell you about Nancy Green. Nancy Hayes was born on March 4th, 1834, on a farm along Somerset Creek, about 6 miles outside of Mount Sterling in Montgomery County, Kentucky. She came into this world as someone's property. Born enslaved in the antebellum South, where her life wasn't her own from the moment she drew breath. The farm where she was born was typical of the area. Local farmers named Green raised tobacco, hay, cattle, and hogs. And it was hard agricultural work under the Kentucky sun, and Nancy learned early what it meant to labor for others without compensation. Slave labor is what she provided, and so did the man who eventually became her husband. Toiling in those same fields was a man named George Green. With George, Nancy had at least 2 children, possibly as many as 4. One child was born in 1862, right in the middle of the Civil War, when the entire country was being torn apart over the very system that held Nancy in chains. I can't give you specifics on how many members of Nancy's family there actually were, because the records just don't exist. There were no birth certificates or marriage licenses for enslaved people. The hard, cold truth is that their lives just weren't considered worth documenting officially. By the end of the American Civil War in 1865, Nancy's personal world had collapsed as the nation was rebuilding. She had lost her husband George and all of her children. The exact circumstances aren't clear from the records. Any number of things could have claimed them: disease, war, or simply the brutal realities of slavery. We can't know for certain. What we do know is that by the time freedom came, Nancy was alone in the world at the age of 31. She lived in a wood-framed shack behind a grand home on Main Street in Covington, Kentucky. The shack was still standing as of 2020. It was shown on a video on the YouTube channel called Family Tree Nuts. I'll leave a link to their channel on this video. The fact that her shack was still standing in 2020 and may very well still be standing today is a testament to how recent this history really was. While the grand home housed the Walker family, Nancy lived in their servants' quarters, technically free but still dependent on the same family that had once owned her. Nancy Green had worked for the Walker family throughout her enslavement as an adult. Samuel Johnson Walker and his wife Amanda employed her as a servant, nurse, nanny, housekeeper, and cook. She had essentially raised their children, and when freedom came, she continued working for them in the only capacity she knew. The Walker family was prominent in Kentucky society. Samuel Walker was the son of Kentucky Governor Charles S. Moorhead, which gave the family significant political and social connections. Nancy cared for their sons, who would grow up to become Chicago Circuit Judge Charles Moorhead Walker and Dr. Samuel J. Walker. These boys she helped raise would later become some of the most powerful men in Chicago. In the early 1870s, the Walker family made a decision that would change Nancy's life forever. They moved to Chicago. The Great Chicago Fire had occurred in 1871, and the city was rebuilding with unprecedented opportunities for those with capital to invest. The Walkers bought up property on Ashland Avenue from Madison Street to 39th Street, part of which developed into a neighborhood for former Kentuckians, including the future mayor, Carter Harrison Sr. Nancy moved with them, settling in what was called the Kentucky Colony, a swank residential district near Ashland Avenue and Washington Boulevard, where many transplanted Kentuckians made their homes. But while the Walkers were building their wealth and status in their new city, Nancy remained in service, still working as their housekeeper and cook. Not much had changed for her personally. New city, same life. It was 1872 when they arrived in Chicago, and Nancy was 38 years old. She had spent her entire adult life in service to one family, first as a slave, then as a paid domestic worker. But Chicago was a different kind of city than what she had known in Kentucky. It was rapidly industrializing, full of immigrants and opportunities, and it would soon host an event that would make Nancy Green one of the most famous women, one of the most famous people, period, in America. The story of how Nancy Green became Aunt Jemima begins not with her, but with two white men in St. Joseph, Missouri, who were trying to save a failing business. In 1888, Chris L. Rutt, a local newspaper editor, and his friend, Charles G. Underwood, bought a small flour mill at 214 North 2nd Street in St. Joseph. They turned it into a business and named it Pearl Milling Company. There, they produced various milled products using a pearl milling process, but they were facing an oversaturated flour market that was making it nearly impossible to turn a profit. After a year of experimentation, they came up with something new, America's first ready-made pancake mix. They called it self-rising pancake flour, and it was revolutionary for its time. Instead of mixing flour, baking powder, sugar, salt, and other ingredients from scratch every morning, housewives could simply add water to this pre-mixed flour and have perfect pancakes. But they needed a brand name that would distinguish their product from the competition. In late 1889, Chris Rutt found that inspiration when he went to a vaudeville show in St. Joseph, where he saw a performer in blackface singing a song called Old Aunt Jemima. The performer wore an apron and bandana, portraying the mammy stereotype that was popular in minstrel shows of that era. Chris thought this image would be perfect for marketing their pancake mix. The Aunt Jemima character conjured up images of a jolly plantation cook who made the best pancakes in the Old South. It was pure fantasy, but it was exactly the kind of nostalgic mythology that a lot of white Americans wanted to believe about slavery because it made them feel comfortable. Unfortunately for Chris Rutt and Charles Underwood, they didn't have enough capital to properly market their product, and by 1890, they had to sell their formula to R.T. Davis Milling Company in St. Joseph. But Davis was a savvy businessman who understood something that Chris and Charles didn't. He knew that he needed to bring Aunt Jemima to life. R.T. Davis had worked in the flour industry for decades and knew how to market products successfully. He had bought the Aunt Jemima recipe and brand name, but he wanted to do something that had never been done before: create a living trademark. So he went to work on that task. R.T. Davis sent out a casting call for a gregarious, theatrical black woman who could cook the pancake mix at big demonstrations. He was looking for someone who could embody the Aunt Jemima character and bring her to life for the public. This is where Judge Charles Moorhead Walker re-enters the story. Remember, he's one of the boys Nancy Green had nursed as a baby and helped raise. Well, Judge Walker recommended Nancy for the position with R.T. Davis Milling Company. After all, he had grown up eating her cooking, and he knew she had a warm personality and natural storytelling ability. And that was that. Without her permission, consent, input, or feedback, in 1890, at the age of 56, Nancy Green was hired by the R.T. Davis Milling Company to become the first living Aunt Jemima. The company was preparing for the biggest marketing opportunity of this century, the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, where millions of visitors from around the world would come to see the latest innovations and products America had to offer. Nancy would be the centerpiece of their exhibition. Dressed as a plantation mammy in an apron and kerchief, she would cook pancakes, sing songs, and tell romanticized stories about the Old South. The company created an entire fictional backstory for the Aunt Jemima character. She was supposed to be a happy slave who had worked on Colonel Higby's Louisiana plantation and had a secret family recipe that made the best pancakes in Dixie. None of this was true, of course. Nancy had never worked on a Louisiana plantation, and she had certainly never been a happy slave. And the pancake recipe wasn't even hers. But truth wasn't the point. Marketing was. The World's Columbian Exposition opened in Chicago on May 1st, 1893, and it was unlike anything America had ever seen. The fair celebrated the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in America, if you can call it that. And the fair showcased the technological marvels of the late 19th century. Over 27 million people would visit the fair during its 6-month run. By this time, Nancy Green was 59 years old, but she worked with all of the vigor and enthusiasm of a 20-year-old. She made her debut as Aunt Jemima beside the world's largest flour barrel, a massive structure that stood 24 feet high and 16 feet in diameter. Visitors would walk through this giant flour barrel and emerge to find Nancy cooking pancakes on an electric griddle, one of the technological marvels of the fair. I guess that for Americans back then, the closest comparison that we would have for today would be something like attending a technology convention. In 1893, they were introduced to the electric griddle. In 2025, we get to see the AI girlfriend. The Philadelphia Inquirer reported on the novel application of electricity to the daily needs of men and women that the cooking demonstration represented. Nancy wasn't just making pancakes, she was showcasing cutting-edge technology. The electric pancake griddle could heat up in 1 minute and produce the prettiest flapjacks you ever saw, even, brown, and no muss. But Nancy's appeal went far beyond the technology. She was a natural entertainer. She sang spirituals, told stories, both from her real life and the fictional plantation tales that the company had written for her. And she charmed the visitors with her personality. One newspaper reporter wrote about receiving a silver dollar-sized pancake from Nancy, saying it was so delicate and beautiful he couldn't bear to eat it. Here, you can see for yourself in this August 12, 1893 edition of the Daily Sentinel. There's even a drawing of Aunt Jemima at her booth. The writer was J.H. Beadle, and he wrote, quote, "Near the mills, for instance, is a mammoth barrel, and an inscription thereon invites one to walk through and get an Aunt Jemima pancake free. I walked through, interviewed Aunt Jemima, and got a pancake. It almost brought a tear to my eye. I could not think of eating the delicate, beautiful little thing. I had a silver dollar in my pocket by chance. I placed it gently on the pancake, and just enough of the yellow fringe showed around the border to make a fair model of an annular eclipse of the sun. The weight of the pancake was not quite 1/5 of that dollar, but it was free." End quote. Nancy's performance was so popular that extra security was needed to keep the crowds moving through the exhibition. According to legend, she sold 50,000 boxes of pancake mix during the fair, an astounding number for the time. Even Thomas Edison, the inventor who had electrified much of the fair, was drawn to Nancy's booth. One newspaper reported that Thomas Edison had become separated from his friends during a visit to the exposition, and when they found him, he was in the agricultural building at Nancy's pancake exhibit, apparently drawn by the smell of her cooking. So it's wild to think about it, because we don't always necessarily match up people from long ago in different fields existing at the same time in history, and certainly not crossing paths. But yes, the man who invented the long-lasting incandescent light bulb met the first Aunt Jemima and even ate pancakes that she prepared for him. Here's an account of that story taken directly from the St. Joseph Gazette in September of 1893. This part of the story takes off from where Thomas Edison was walking the fairgrounds with his friends, and then all of a sudden they lost him. One of the men in his party went to search for Edison, and, quote, "While searching through the agricultural building, glancing to the right and left, he suddenly spied Mr. Edison at last, near the R.T. Davis Mill Company's exhibit, with an Aunt Jemima pancake in each hand, thoroughly enjoying himself." End quote. And here's another story about Edison's time at the exhibit that I thought you might like to see just because there's a drawing of him in it. Nancy received a medal and a certificate from the exposition officials for her successful demonstration. But most importantly, she had become one of the most recognizable faces in America almost overnight. After the spectacular success of the World's Fair, Nancy Green was reportedly offered a lifetime contract to continue representing Aunt Jemima. For the next 20 years, she traveled the country on promotional tours, appearing at fairs, festivals, food shows, and local grocery stores. Her arrival in any town was heralded by large billboards featuring her image and the caption, "I's in town, honey." She would set up her cooking demonstrations, flip pancakes with theatrical flair that newspapers called pancake turner gymnastics, and she would tell stories to crowds who lined up to meet the famous Aunt Jemima. Nancy became what we would now recognize as one of America's first celebrity chefs. Decades before Julia Child or Rachel Ray, Nancy Green was demonstrating cooking techniques and promoting food products to audiences across the country. She was one of the first Black American women to achieve national celebrity status. The company created extensive marketing materials around Nancy and the Aunt Jemima character. They produced paper dolls showing Aunt Jemima's family before and after they supposedly sold the family secret recipe. The before set showed the family in shabby clothing without shoes, while the after set showed them in fancy clothes, perpetuating the myth that the pancake recipe had made them wealthy. They also circulated pamphlets detailing the quote-unquote life of Aunt Jemima, portraying her as a happy slave who had diverted Union soldiers during the Civil War with her pancakes long enough for her master to escape, and according to their story of her life, she had even revived shipwrecked soldiers with her flapjacks. Of course, none of these stories were true, but they helped to build the mythology around the brand. Nancy toured extensively throughout the 1890s and early 1900s. She appeared at the World's Fair in San Antonio and countless other exhibitions. However, in 1900, she refused to cross the ocean for the Paris exhibition. Here was her response to that assignment that was printed in numerous papers. Quote, "No, sir," she said. "There ain't no man gonna sit me on the water. I was born in this country, and I'm gonna die here, not somewhere twixt here and somewheres else." End quote. Whether her resistance was due to fear of sea travel or other reasons, she made it abundantly clear that she wasn't going. So the company replaced her with Agnes Moody, who was described as a negress of 60 years. While Nancy Green was achieving unprecedented fame as Aunt Jemima, and American audiences believed her story about humble beginnings that had turned her into a rich woman because of her pancake recipe, her personal life told a very different story. Despite being one of the most recognizable women in America, she was not becoming wealthy at all from her celebrity. The 1900 census listed her occupation as cook, which could have referred to her Aunt Jemima demonstrations or indicated that she was still working in domestic service. By 1910, when she was 76 years old, the census clearly listed her as a housekeeper in a private residence. Her vast amount of fame had not lifted her out of domestic work. Nancy lived with various relatives in Chicago's Fuller Park and Grand Boulevard neighborhoods, areas that were home to working-class Black Americans, not wealthy celebrities. Few people in her daily life were even aware of her role as Aunt Jemima. The character was famous, but Nancy Green, the person, remained largely unknown. Despite the claims of a lifetime contract that supposedly made her wealthy, Nancy Green continued to work as a domestic servant well into her 70s. Historians who have studied her life extensively found no evidence that she ever became wealthy from her portrayal of Aunt Jemima. As one researcher put it, the available evidence suggests otherwise. But thankfully for Nancy, the person, she didn't get caught up in being Aunt Jemima. She had a real life outside of that public persona. Nancy Green was an active member of Chicago's Olivet Baptist Church, which during her lifetime became the largest Black American church in the United States, with over 9,000 members. That number would make it a megachurch even by today's standards. Olivet Baptist Church was noted for its work to protect people who had escaped slavery and arrived in Chicago seeking refuge. The church provided sanctuary because there were still active slave catchers operating in Chicago, pursuing Black people even after the Civil War, when slavery was abolished. Though she was known to millions of people as Aunt Jemima, those fans were mere vanity numbers. Her meaningful work was the advocacy work she performed through her church, working hand in hand with people who didn't know that she was a celebrity. Nancy used her position at Olivet Baptist Church to advocate for social causes. She became an advocate against poverty and in favor of equal rights through her work at church. This aspect of her life was largely overlooked by the media coverage of her Aunt Jemima persona, but it represents the real woman behind the character, and she would go on to do the work that was important to her until the end of her life. By 1923, Nancy Green was 89 years old and had lived through the entire transformation of America from a rural, agricultural society to an industrial, urban nation. She had been born before the railroad connected the East Coast to the West Coast, and she lived to see the age of electric lights, radio, and, unfortunately, automobiles. Here's what I mean. On August 30th, 1923, Nancy was standing under the elevated train tracks on East 46th Street on Chicago's South Side. She was near her home at 4543 South Indiana Avenue, in a neighborhood she knew well. That address actually belonged to her great-nephew and his wife. She was living with them at the time, still dependent on family for housing despite her decades of fame. What happened next was a kind of senseless accident that was becoming all too common in the automobile age. Dr. H.S. Seymour, a pharmacist, was driving when his car collided with a laundry truck. The impact sent his vehicle careening out of control, and it hurtled onto the sidewalk where Nancy was standing. The 89-year-old woman who had survived slavery, the Civil War, Reconstruction, and a complete transformation of American society was killed instantly by this random collision of modern machinery. Can you imagine living through some of the most difficult conditions imaginable and to make it to the age of 89 and then to die for any reason that's not related to poor health, old age, or natural causes? The accident made front-page news across the nation, not because Nancy Green, the person, was considered important, but because Aunt Jemima had died. Headlines read, "Aunt Jemima of pancake fame is killed by auto," and "Pancake Mammy is dead." Even in death, her real identity was overshadowed by the character that she had portrayed. You can even see here that when the Kansas City Sun reported on her death, the story says that the milling company bought her pancake recipe, which we know is not true. The marketing stayed with her beyond her death. The Chicago Tribune reported on September 8, 1923, that a grand jury investigated the case and found both drivers criminally responsible for her death. They were charged with manslaughter, with 6 additional people being sent to Bridewell jail for drinking in connection with the accident. Despite her decades of fame and her role in building one of America's most successful food brands, Nancy Green was buried in a pauper's grave in Oakwoods Cemetery in Chicago. Her final resting place was an unmarked plot near a wall on the northeast quadrant of the cemetery, the section reserved for those who died without means to pay for a proper burial. For 97 years, Nancy Green lay in that unmarked grave while the Aunt Jemima brand continued to generate millions of dollars in profits for its corporate owners. Generation after generation of Americans ate pancakes with her image on the box, or some iteration of it, never knowing that the real woman behind the character had died in poverty and been forgotten. The irony is palpable. Nancy Green had earned so much money for others, yet she died with so little money that she couldn't even afford a headstone. It wasn't until 2015 that anyone even knew where Nancy Green was buried. Sherry Williams, founder of the Bronzeville Historical Society, spent 15 years researching and searching for Nancy's final resting place. Sherry Williams was determined to ensure that Nancy Green received proper recognition for her contributions to American business and culture. When Sherry finally located the grave, she reached out to Quaker Oats, the company that had owned the Aunt Jemima brand since 1926, to ask if they would support placing a monument on Nancy's grave. The company's reported response was telling. Nancy Green and Aunt Jemima aren't the same. Aunt Jemima is a fictitious character. But Sherry didn't give up. She organized a fundraising effort and successfully raised money for a proper headstone. On September 5, 2020, nearly a century after Nancy Green's death, a headstone was finally placed on her grave with her photograph etched into the stone. The timing was significant. Just months earlier, in June 2020, Quaker Oats had announced that they would retire the Aunt Jemima brand, acknowledging that it was based on a racial stereotype. The brand was rebranded as Pearl Milling Company. You might remember that name from this story. It's the name of the original company that had created the pancake mix. So, a bit of a full circle moment. Nancy Green's story raises uncomfortable questions about American capitalism, exploitation, and corporate responsibility. Again, she was arguably America's first celebrity chef. Yet, she lived her entire life in poverty. The contrast with modern celebrity endorsement deals is stark. Today, a spokesperson who helped build a multi-billion-dollar brand would expect to receive millions in compensation. Nancy Green received wages as a domestic worker. The most tragic irony of Nancy Green's story is that she lived to see the dawn of the modern age, but died at the hands of it. She was killed by one of the signature inventions of that modern age, the automobile. The very symbol of 20th century progress and prosperity became the instrument of her death. In the end, Nancy Green's story is about more than pancakes or corporate branding. I wanted to share her story with you because she deserves to be remembered for more than just the character she portrayed. She was Nancy Green, not just Aunt Jemima. She was a real person with her own hopes, struggles, and achievements. And her story reminds us that behind every brand, every image, every corporate success story are real people like you and me. From famous to forgotten, that was Nancy Green's journey. But now, finally, with a headstone marking her grave and historians telling her real story, perhaps Nancy Green can be remembered not just as the woman who played Aunt Jemima, but as the woman she actually was. There was another woman who was born into similar circumstances as Nancy Green, and she also became the face of a company, but it was her own company, Madam C.J. Walker. While she wasn't born into slavery, everyone else in her family was. She was born free, into a family of sharecroppers who had been enslaved, and she started her own hair care brand that turned her into a millionaire. To see what happened to her fortune, you can watch my video about her daughter here. I will also leave links to it in the description box. My sources for this video are on the screen. This video has been brought to you by me. Well, me and my new YouTube channel, Verified YouTube Guide. Are you just starting your YouTube journey and feeling overwhelmed? Don't worry, I've got you covered. My channel, Verified YouTube Guide, is your go-to resource for practical, step-by-step tips to grow and monetize your channel. It's literally follow-along video tutorials. I'm showing you the steps I took to get 180,000 subscribers on YouTube. So if you don't know how to do something, you can just copy my work one step at a time. From setting up your channel to showing you how you can earn money at any stage on YouTube. And I'm not just talking about YouTube ad revenue. If you have something important to say or a service to sell, start talking about it on YouTube now. Don't wait. Subscribe to Verified YouTube Guide today, and let's build your channel together. You don't have to figure this out alone. The link is in the description box. I'll see you there. I hope that you have enjoyed this tale so far. If you love these scandalous stories from history that make Ty's Hot Mess History a time capsule for the culture, hit subscribe and the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Give this video a thumbs up. It's free and helps a ton. Whether you're watching or listening, thank you for letting me be a part of your day.